Hey, it's Cayman with S&B, and today we're going to be talking about how the fuel gauge should be showing on your S&B fuel tank, whether it's a 40 gallon, 45 gallon, or 47 gallon tank. So after you have the tank installed, or before, you're going to want to make sure to look at your VIN, and you can call S&B, give us your VIN, which is just right here, and we're going to look it up in the Mercedes after sales software and look to see if your van has a J51 program on it. And the J51 program is a program that basically tells the computer in the van to look at the fuel float on the sending unit and use the fuel float to move the needle up and down. So using the fuel float to move the gauge up and down on the van's instrument cluster versus using consumption through the fuel injectors to move the needle inside. So J51 was designed where when people are using a fuel tap out of the send unit, you don't want to be using consumption through the fuel injectors if you're using a fuel tap, because the fuel consumption through the diesel heater through your auxiliary fuel tap is not going through the injectors. So there could be a point where you're burning a whole bunch of fuel through the diesel heater and the gauge isn't registering because it doesn't see fuel flow through the fuel injectors. So J51 is important with the S&B tank as well, because we are giving you a bigger tank and there's more capacity. And so when the gauge is full, when the float is in a full upright position, if you don't have J51, the vans can only think you have 24 gallons in the tank versus having 47 gallons. So it's going to start that countdown of how much diesel you're burning through a 24 gallon tank versus a 47 gallon tank. So if you don't have J51, you could see a situation where the gauge shows an empty tank when you really have almost more than a half a tank left, because it's going to think it's counting down from 24 when it's actually should be counting down from 47. So we'll just show you in here what the gauge and what I'm talking about. So this is the gauge. You know, some of them have the tick marks over here on the left, but this reading here, it'll stay on full for longer because there's more fuel above that fuel float level. But after you burn about five or so gallons, it'll start to move down as normal. And so that's if you have J51. Again, but your distance to empty reading, knowing how many miles till empty you have, is basically just a calculation off of your float position in the tank and how many gallons the computer of the van thinks you have. So your distance to empty calculation will not be accurate, and there's no way to update your distance to empty, because unfortunately you can't change the fuel tank size in the van's computer. So the van still thinks you have a 24 gallon tank. So when that tank, when the S&B tank is full, you know, it might only think you can go 300 miles when you can actually go 600 miles with the S&B. So it's always going to show about half of what you can actually go, because that value wasn't changed in the van's computer. So the gauge position will be accurate. It'll stay on full for longer. But that distance to empty is always going to show about half of what you can actually go. Now we're going to talk about a little bit of issues, or some issues that we've seen with the gauge reading on Sprinter tanks. We've been making the tanks since I think the end of 2021, and we've learned a lot, and the computers and the vehicles have continued to get smarter. But we're going to talk about just one install issue that could lead to an improper reading on the gauge. When you install, and this is all in all of our install instructions and install videos, but when you install this in unit, we've seen it where this Venturi tube, which basically pulls fuel from the back of the tank and brings it into the fuel bucket to keep this completely topped off, gets stuck to the outer wall. So it gets stuck right there, and your fuel float will either get stuck on the up position or on the down position. So that's if you don't see it move past empty or full, or sorry, if you don't see it move past half a tank or go down under half a tank, this would be your issue. And this is resolved by removing these 5 bolts, and you can stick a long screwdriver and free up this Venturi tube. So if it's stuck here, you just take a screwdriver and pop it into the position. It should be looking like this, so the float can move up and down. Again, this is in every install instruction, just to make sure this issue is avoided before the tank is installed. It's really easy to do, just to pop out these bolts and just do a visual check. But if you have that issue, you can drop the tank, remove these bolts without removing this in unit, and use a long screwdriver to free it up, and your gauge should be moving with no issue. Now, for all the tanks that we built prior to August 2023, we did not replace the OEM float when we did these installs or with the tank. We never saw a reason to in any of our testing, but we slowly started to hear about more and more issues when vans that already had J51 still had an issue with the gauge reading. They were basically seeing on a long trip, when they started off with a full tank, they would see their gauge after 100 miles drop from full all the way down to half. They're thinking that there's something, basically the computer thinking that there's something wrong. And to explain the issue that we found, when the fuel float goes all the way up, there's still quite a bit of fuel above the stock float. So that's why the gauge will be pegged on full for about the first 5 to 7 gallons. And so the reason this was happening is the computer wouldn't see the fuel float move for quite some time, and it would basically trigger an alert to the computer and tell the computer to start dropping that gauge quick, thinking that there was something wrong, thinking there was a leak in the tank, and so the driver would pull over and refuel. So this clears itself up if you're having the issue, if you turn the van off or turn it back on. And if you ever got a code for it, it could easily be cleared by any handheld code clear to resolve the issue if your gauge just gets stuck on empty. But a fix to this issue is we designed a fuel float that's longer. So for all the tanks prior to August 2023, we have these modified floats that you have to request from S&B. And the reason we have them modified is because the baffle that's right in front of the float would get hit if we didn't modify it. So if you have this issue, make sure to reach out to S&B. We'll get you one of these specially modified fuel floats that are just slightly bent to avoid that baffle. But all the S&B tanks now come with a longer float. So you can just see it's only about an inch taller. And so what that does is that fuel float just gets up to a higher level in the tank. So when it's completely full, this float's going to reach up higher, so there's less fuel above the fuel float, and it doesn't trigger that alert to the computer that thinking that there's something wrong. I know it can be a little bit confusing, and hopefully this video explained a little bit more about how the gauge works and what problems we had in the past. But to basically summarize it up, if you're looking to buy a S&B replacement tank for your Sprinter now, ensure you have J51 so your computer knows how to move the fuel float correctly. Then after that, simply just install the S&B fuel float and you won't have any issues. Just know that your distance to empty is going to read about half of what you can actually go, and your gauge will stay a little bit longer on full, but other than that, we'll read correctly. Thank you for all your patience, everyone that's been a huge supporter of S&B tanks. And for the people that have had issues, thank you for your patience in working with us, and hopefully we can get all the issues that are out in the field resolved and continue to deliver a great product to the industry. Thank you.